Good morning. Welcome to our class again together. I'm glad that you joined me today. We are continuing and almost to the end of our series on the life of Moses. Today, we come to the end of Moses' life. I like to wander around and through cemeteries, especially old ones. I know that can be kind of strange for some people, but I love to see how people get remembered on their tombstones. Now, I like the tombstone of Mel Blanc. Now, he was the voice of cartoon characters such as Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. And his tombstone is graced with his signature phrase, "That's all, folks." One of my favorite is in a cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, the grave of the former poet laureate Conrad Aiken, a native son of Savannah. On it is the phrase Cosmos Mariner, which means star wanderer, followed by destination unknown. But others are more humorous. There's a grave of a lawyer, his name is Sir John Strange, and it says, "Here lies an honest lawyer, and that is strange." And another says, "Here lies Ezekiel Akel, age 102. The good die young." So today I think we ought to go to the funeral of Moses. How is he remembered, and what would go on his tombstone? In Deuteronomy, Moses gives the law for the second time to a generation who were only children when he came down from Mount Sinai the first time. In it, he warns them about the dangers of a good land and one in which they will enjoy the blessings that they never did earn. As he starts to come to the end, he wants to give his final instructions as to the future. So Moses continued to speak these words to all of Israel. And he said, "I'm 120 years old. I am no longer able to go out and come in. The Lord has said to me, 'You shall not go over this Jordan.' But the Lord your God himself will go over before you. He will destroy the nations before you so that you can dispossess them. And Joshua will go as your head, as the Lord has spoken." Moses realized his situation and has accepted it. He has followed God's instructions and installed Joshua as the new leader of Israel. But he reminds them that whether it be Moses or Joshua, God himself will be their leader. It was something that Moses believed his entire life. So in the final chapter of Deuteronomy, we come to the close of Moses' life. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the land. On the east side of the Jordan is a mountain called Nebo, with a peak called Pisgah. Here is where the final scene of Moses' life will take place. Nebo is 2,300 feet in elevation, and Moses climbs to Pisgah, or the Hebrew word for the summit. And now there is a vista that is spread before him. The Lord showed him all the land: Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea. He could see the Golan Heights to the north, the Mediterranean to the west, the deserts of Saudi Arabia to the east. At his feet lay the fertile valley of Jericho, where the first great battle of the Promised Land would be fought. He would see the Jordan as it snaked its way from north to south as it emptied into the Dead Sea. Beyond Jericho, there's a small mount, a mount that at that time was called Salem. One day it would be renamed by one of God's own people. His name would be David. He would call it Jerusalem. And the glorious temple would stand there. And one day an invading army would burn it. Here before him stood the future. But what did Moses see? One thing was that he saw God's promise being fulfilled. It had been half a millennium Since Abraham stood in that grassland and saw the myriad of stars and heard God say, I will give you and your descendants this land. But first, there will be 400 years in which they'll be abused and enslaved. For all of those centuries, they told that story, but it only remained a story. But on that summit, the Lord spoke, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I will let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go there. For Moses, faith had become sight. Promise had become reality. But in that moment, he could see more than that. The view from Pisgah must have been interesting. He can turn and look backwards, and then turn again and see the future. He could turn to the southwest, and in the far distance was the Sinai Peninsula. There at Sinai was where the law was given. He could trace the way through the deserts to Kadesh Barnea, the place where the spies had left from 40 years before. And he knew somewhere in between there was a rock that he struck that caused this present moment to happen. And then he could turn back and see the future. This says something about death, the death we all face one day. When we get close to the end, we get two different views of life. We get to see the entirety of our lives, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Nothing more can be done. Life has been lived, and we turn and we see a glimpse of eternity at the same time. We see a different life in front of us. It's something we sing about, something we talk about. But I noticed something. Until you get to the moment, as Moses got to that moment, you really can't see the promised land. I had a church member one time that was dying of cancer. He had lung cancer. It wouldn't be long until he would die, and I entered the hospital room on a Saturday afternoon at a difficult time. The family was having to make this agonizing decision of whether to insert a feeding tube. One of the daughters said, Daddy keeps saying, I want to go home. I think we ought to take him back to the house. I couldn't restrain myself. So I spoke up. No, he doesn't want to go back to his house. He wants to go home. The home that he's now seen and is ready. And within a day, he died. Paul would write, as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear has heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. No one could really know what happens beyond the veil until God pulls it back and shows it to you. Then, and only then, do you know the glory that's prepared for you. And then Moses dies. It is in that reality of death that we all die alone. We travel alone to the end. No one can share the experience of that moment. Now, there may be people in the room, but we make the journey without them. Even Joshua, who was always with Moses as assistant, was not there on Nebo. There on that mountain was only God and Moses. You see, when we come to our own end, it'll only be us and God. No one travels with us. They can't experience, they don't understand it. And so we read, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. God buries Moses himself. No one has God as their undertaker because Moses was different. I think there's a little bit of melancholy in this verse. We want to keep Moses. It's normal. We've enjoyed his story. We've watched with the drama and with the disappointment all the time. He's got to be known as such a familiar figure. But that's our experience because we always want to hold on to the ones we love. But instead, we have to let them go and place them in the hands of God. To this day, the text says no one knows where he's buried. Now, there are hucksters in Jordan that will take you to what they say is the burial place of Moses. But they play the fool, for only God knows the location of that grave. There is no tombstone. There is no marker. There is no map. Just the memory of eternity. But Moses is not just buried in Deuteronomy. You don't come to this moment and he goes, he's buried and we move on. For a moment at least, Deuteronomy stands and admires and remembers. We do this at funerals. We're sad that they're gone, but glad that they lived. And so we speak of their life and how they lived it. And that was true about Moses as well. Deuteronomy 34 and verse 7 says, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. The text gives his age as 120 years. His life fits into neat thirds. He spends the first 40 years of his life growing up in Egypt. The second triad seems so wasted as he's a shepherd in Sinai's desert, but it was really God's training ground for greater things. And his last act was taking God's people out of Egyptian bondage, giving them the standards of God, and leading them to the promised land. It says his vision was undimmed and his vigor unabated. The word for vigor is a term that describes green wood that is still pliable and growing. And I suspect it's not just physical. After all, there is a physical element to it. The story is about a 120-year-old man who hikes up a 23-foot mountain. How many people do you know that can do that? But I also believe there's a spiritual component to that. He never lost the vision of what God wanted him to do. And he never lost the strength to do it. One of the great tragedies of life, of many of those who are older, is they forget to have a future focus. They can only relive the glory days. They spend time rehearsing history and past accomplishments and all the places they had succeeded and all the great things they had done. But if you ever ask what's going to happen next, they shrug off that question and just return to the good old days. They're rusting away. But Moses didn't rust out. He was vibrant to the very end. See, the question we all have to ask ourselves as we grow older, are we growing older or are we growing old? Those are two different things. I've known people who grow old in their 30s. Every one of us grows older. Every birthday that comes along, we get one more year. But whether we grow old is our choice. There are too many people who die at 65, but they're buried at 85. They're just waiting for their funeral. Now, Longfellow chides us about this. He writes a poem that says, "But why, you ask, should this tale be told to men grow old who are growing old? It's too late. Ah, nothing's too late, till the tired heart shall cease to palpitate." Cato learned Greek at 80. Sophocles wrote his grand Oedipus, and Simonides bore the prize of verse from his composers when he had numbered more than fourscore years. And Theophrastus, at fourscore and 10, had begun his characters of men. Chaucer at Woodstock with the nightingales at 60 wrote the Canterbury Tales. Goethe at Weimar, toiling to the last, completed Faust when 80 years were past. These are indeed exceptions, but they show how far the Gulf Stream of our youth may flow into the Arctic regions of our life where little else than life itself survives. What then? Shall we sit idly down and say, the night hath come, it's no longer day? The night hath not come. We are not quite cut off from the labor by the failing light. Something remains for us to do or dare. Even the oldest tree some fruit must bear. Not Oedipus, Colonius, or Greek ode, or tales of pilgrims that one morning rode out of the gateway of the Tarbert Inn, and other something would we but begin. For age is opportunity, no less than youth itself, though in another dress. And as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars, invisible by day. Moses kept living his life for the rest of his life until the end of his life. Shouldn't we? But we also remember Moses. When Moses didn't return, Israel knew the end had come. When someone dies, we take a moment to remember. Remember what they did, but we also remember so much more. Israel remembered how they felt. It says, and the people of Israel wept for Moses, the plains of Moab, for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. They stopped everything for an entire month. No preparations, no plans, no movement, just tears. This is a simple statement of the people who complained so much about Moses, but they loved him intensely. Remember something, that you never knew what you have until it's gone. So remember, take the time when someone died to remember. It's good for all of us. It's good for life. But God also remembers as well. In the 5th verse, God gives great praise. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. Nothing is said about great deeds. He's not remembered for his miraculous delivery at his birth, or for the standing before the burning bush, or the plagues that freed the people of Israel from Egyptian bondage, or of him standing by the Red Sea with his staff over the sea as it parted, or him coming down with the tablets of law in his hand. Instead, what is said is who he was. The greatest honor that God gives someone is a simple epitaph that says, here is a servant of God. Anything else is not of great worth to eternity. But God also remembered his character. What is God going to say about you? But then Deuteronomy and the books of Moses close with this statement. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of Israel. Now, did Moses write that paragraph? I suspect not, because he's much too humble to brag on himself at death. Only small men do that. One of the great truths of Scripture, we don't know which hand writes something down, but that doesn't make any difference to make it God's voice. Inspiration is independent of reputation, of the knowledge of a name. The anonymous can be inspired. So whatever hand wrote the words, God put them on the page. This is God's estimation. Of all the things that Moses did, there was no one like him in all of Israel. How much higher praise can a man or a woman get? Remember, the day's going to come, and it is then we know God's estimation. As Paul would write to the Corinthians, now the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites couldn't gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end. Will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if what was brought to an end came with glory, much more will be made permanent. What is permanent have glory. Since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who put a veil over his face so the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what had been brought to an end, but we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed in the same image from one degree of glory to another. From this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. As we all stand on our own Pisgah, we need to remember a simple but profound truth. You are remembered by the life that you live, not the death that you died. One day, someone's going to sit down and have to write your obituary. And they're going to ask themselves a simple question. What would they want said about them? So while living, you should ask two questions and adjust your living according to the answers. What do you want people to say about you? What do you want your children to say? What about your friends? What even maybe your enemies? What do you want them to say about you? Because somebody will. They will talk one way or another. They'll have an estimation or an opinion. Now, sometimes I have found it hard to say things at funerals. It's not because the person didn't live, it's because of the kind of life that they lived. I remember I did a funeral of a woman who was shot to death by her husband while in the arms of another man in a bar. I didn't have family members to tell me anything about this woman, only the gory details given to me by the funeral director. I had very little to say. What do you say about someone who has a life in a situation like that? And on the morning of the funeral, I remember I went outside and my neighbor came over and she said, I saw in the paper where you're going to do that funeral. He said, I had her kids in my class at school, and I don't think she was beating those kids. I said, please don't help me. I don't have anything good to say about her now. How tragic that you've lived your whole life and there's nothing good to say about you. But the second question is, what do you want God to say about you? That's the most important question because we can fool people. But God, oh, God knows our hearts. God knows our intentions. For Moses, being a servant of God was the highest honor. Is that what God would say about you? Just remember that while you're living, you're writing your own obituary. Just ask Alfred Nobel. Nobel was a chemist in Stockholm, Sweden. He invented a material we call dynamite, which elevated warfare to an even deadlier level. Now you didn't kill people, you killed multitudes. And as with most famous men, newspapers always had a writer who would keep track of potential obituaries and keep the obituaries updated so if the person died, it could be printed quickly. One day, Nobel unfolded his newspaper and was aghast at the headlines. It was a story mistakenly put into the paper about supposedly his death. The headline read, "The Merchant of Death is dead." Shocked by such an epitaph, he took steps to erase that reputation before he died. He took vast sums of his fortune and established a series of prizes in science and literature. But there was one that he decided that needed to be made that was distinct from the rest. It was a prize for peace. So today, no one knows Alfred Nobel as the Merchant of Death. Today, the prize for peace bears both his name and his likeness. So what do you want in your obituary? Because you're writing it today. Thank you for being with me today. Next week, we'll complete our series on Moses as we see all the choices that Moses made through his life. Again, thank you for being with me, and I hope you have enjoyed our time together, and you'll be with me again at our next session. Have a great day and a great week until we meet again.